by saying hello, everyone. Thank you for joining this Centre for Democratic Futures event, where the authors of Organising for Change meet the critics. I'm Valentina Cardo. I'm Associate Professor of Politics and Identity, and I will be chairing this event today. I'm very delighted to be chairing it. I'm one of the outgoing directors of the Centre for Democratic Futures. We have some new, really exciting, brilliant directors joining us already. They're already in place. So the book, Organising for Change, a very short introduction. It's a book that merges the literatures that are otherwise disparate around social movements and advocacy. And the book argues that these fields are influenced by broader historical contexts, each other and the individuals who work within and sometimes across them. And the book shows the ways in which social change happens, not only through bold and visible protests, but through lifestyles and service provision. And the authors of the book are Clare Saunders and Silke Roth, right in the middle in my screen. So Clare is a professor of environmental politics at Exeter, and Clare's research is more. Have I got that wrong? I can see your face. Sorry, my fault if I got that wrong.
Wrong, Valentina. I am a professor of environmental politics at Exeter, but I work on the Penryn campus in Cornwall. So I always try and get people to add the word Cornwall at the end so that we get a bit better known. Not the
Fair enough.
Campus,
Cornwall.
Campus in Cornwall.
So Clare's research is motivated by the desire to make the world a better place, and a world where we live in a clean environment that is managed by an inclusive and fair democracy. And this has led Clare to chart environmental and social justice movements and thinking about ways to resolve environmental and political conflict, and trying to find ways to encourage people to adopt a more pro-environmental, to encourage more pro-environmental behaviours. Silke Roth is a professor of sociology at the University of Southampton, and she's working on the intersection of political sociology and the sociology of work. And the thread that runs through her work is the question of how organisations overcome and perpetuate inequality through the inclusion and exclusion of different constituencies in membership and leadership, and through their goals and objectives. And she studies various forms of engagement from historical and biographical perspectives. So Clare and Silke will be responding to the critics, who will have each 10 minutes to say whatever they'd like to say about the book. Just a quick introduction to, I'm so sorry, my cat has decided now to make a lot of noise, apologies. So the first to speak, in fact, is Ali Meghji, and who is an associate professor of social inequalities at Magdalen College. Sorry, that was the Oxford pronunciation, Magdalen College at Cambridge University. And his research puts critical race theory into dialogue with post-colonial sociology in order to understand the global dynamics of racialization and racism. Next, in no particular order, by the way, Bandana Purkayastha, who's the Board of Trustee Distinguished Professor of Sociology and Asian American Studies at the University of Connecticut. Her research focuses on gender and intersectionality, migration and migrants, transnationalism, human rights and human security, and violence and peace. Margaret Perez Brower is Assistant Professor of Political Science at the University of Washington, and her work focuses on the politics of race, ethnicity, and gender, and how these politics shape US institutions, higher education, public opinion, and political behavior. And last but not least, John Boswell is Professor of Politics and Public Policy at the University of Southampton, and his interests center around contemporary issues and themes in democratic governance and public policy, with a number of particular interests in, for example, deliberative democracy in theory and practice, bureaucratic encounters and policy feedback, and so on and so forth. So 10 minutes each for the critics, then 10 minutes to Silke and Clare, and then we'll open to the for Q&A at the end. Just before I give the floor to the speakers, I just want to thank Arjun for organising this event. All the tricky bits he's sorted out, so thank you, Arjun, and Tracy for supporting the event and driving from behind the camera. Thank you very much. Ali, you go first.
Cool. Thanks so much for the introduction. Thanks so much, Silke and Clare, as well, for the invitation to read this book. I found it super fascinating. And because I'm first, I'm probably obliged to say that critics is used in a very loose sense. And I hope that all of the criticism is constructive. So just in the 10 minutes, I'll give a quick overview of some of the questions I had about the book, which I thought would make for an interesting discussion afterwards. Most of these questions are actually touched upon in the book already, so it's very much just an invitation to get further thoughts now that some time has passed after the publication. I read the book with great intrigue. I'm not a social movement scholar, and neither am I a scholar of organizations. But the book's central themes of social change, inequality, and power all directly resonated with my own interests in post-colonial critical race and historical sociology. Much like Michel Lamont's recent Seeing Others, I read Organising for Change as being part of a new wave of scholarship in sociology, which seeks to understand social change both from what I call a pragmatic perspective, where change is understood as being often incremental and often nonlinear, but also from a perspective that transcends some of the limitations in social movement scholarship. Unlike Michel's Seeing Others, however, as Silke and Clare adopt a much more explicitly historical scope and sensibility in their understanding of social change, and in doing so also provide an interesting invitation for historical sociologists to return to some of the key questions of the subdiscipline, namely, how does change happen, and is change ever actually durable? In Organising for Change, Silke and Clare bracket out their study to focus on two levels simultaneously, what they term social change organizations and social change makers. In doing so, we could say that their analysis pays attention to both the micro and the meso level, as well as situating these two levels in the context of the macro structures of racism, sexism, capitalism, and so on. While social change organizations are, as the label says, organizations oriented towards social change, whether that be reformist or radical by nature, social change makers refer to people who pursue social change outside of social change organizations, but in relation to their causes. As the authors say, some social change makers pursue the march through the institutions and change mainstream organizations from within. Again, the concept of social change makers appears quite similar to what Lamont terms as change agents in her work, but there is a crucial point of difference, which once again speaks to the synergy that can be developed between these two books. So as I said, Silke and Clare's book, Silke and Clare's approach to social change is focused around this kind of pragmatic approach. This pragmatism, however, does not mean that the authors dismiss more radical calls for systemic change. As they state very explicitly, we sympathize with the notions that incremental change can be disappointing and that structural change is necessary. Yet at the same time, we seek to reorient scholarly literature to more overtly recognize how incremental changes can accumulate, how the compromises of large-scale NGOs can provide fertile ground for the emergence of more critical social change organizations that are able to push forward. And lastly, they want to highlight the ways in which service provision and mutual aid can intersect with other political efforts to secure social change, sometimes as a direct route into social change making. Using the notion of historically variable contexts, as opposed to social movement scholarship's concept of opportunity structures, Silke and Clare then use a wide array of examples stretching over hundreds of years to highlight how social structure, social change organizations, and social change makers all relate to each other in historically specific ways to generate incremental and sometimes more radical forms of change. As I already noted, I really enjoyed reading this book, even though I'm not a movement scholar or an organization scholar. And there are three particular themes I would love to hear more about. As I said, they are topics covered in the book, but which could also form the basis of further inquiries in their own right. And as I said, the critique here is intended to be generative and constructive. So firstly, I would like to hear the authors expand upon their views about the durability of social change. By this, I mean, can we isolate under what historical conditions meaningful, durable change happens, even if it's incremental change, and under which historical conditions does the promise of change actually quickly collapse back into a previous status quo? So I'll clarify this question with 2.5 examples, 1.5 of the examples being historical, the other one being a contemporary example. Historically, with abolition in the US, for instance, you get a very clear intention of social change. But as Du Bois writes about in Black Reconstruction, in the abolition era South, you also had Black codes, which criminalized a variety of everyday actions for Black people, which was coupled with the 13th Amendment, which allowed for enslavement as a punishment. You thus enslavement despite the in the late 50s and 60s, Black Americans were given equality by law for the first time since they were brought to the US as enslaved people in 1619. This is quite obviously a case of positive social change. But as Kimberly Crenshaw writes, 20 years after the introduction of civil rights legislation, Black Americans were actually measuring worse in terms of employment, underemployment, and educational enrollment. So the change, again, was definitely not durable. And then lastly, a contemporary example. Organizations jumped on a BLM bandwagon in 2020 after the murder of George Floyd. As part of their commitment to this movement, Netflix US hired a series of young Black creatives. Yet by 2022, the Black Lives Matter fad ended, and Netflix ended up making most of these new hires redundant, with their projects then cancelled. So again, no durable change despite early promises. And I would really love to hear the author's insights about what conditions make change durable and what conditions make change quickly revert upon itself. Relatedly, to me, part of the answer must lie in the wider social structure, where we consider who is in charge of actually implementing social change to begin with. This was the point that race realists like Derek Bell made in the context of civil rights legislation. As Bell argued, given that the white elite were in charge of implementing civil rights legislation, it is no wonder that these legislative acts did very little for actually combating structural racism. Bell even details examples of civil rights legislation being used to legitimate the very forms of structural racism they were supposed to combat, such as housing and educational segregation. Bell's argument thus turns towards an understanding of interests, and specifically in his concept of interest convergence. He argues that you only get social change when it benefits the interest of the dominant group. And of course, this leads to a much more pessimistic reading of social change than we get in this book, with Bell, along with other race realists, arguing that what appears to be progress is often just the same exploitation repackaged in different ways. And of course, this could just be conflating questions of progress with questions of change, but I would still be interested to hear what the authors think about this more race realist or more pessimistic approach to understanding change through the lens of social interests. And then finally, I just have some closing remarks on social change organizations. And I do wonder about the extent to which we need to differentiate between organizational messaging or organizational goals versus organizational structures. In other words, to differentiate between how organizations position themselves publicly versus how they actually work as organizations. Black Lives Matter, for instance, were incredibly influential in inspiring social change, as the authors note in their book, but at the same time, the organization had clear limitations, as evidenced by the 4 co-founders falling out, as well as the charges of embezzlement and misuse of funds, which created a fissure between Black Lives Matter Grassroots and Black Lives Matter Global Network Foundation. Similarly, with the NAACP, Du Bois himself notes how, despite its commitment to anti-racism, especially the white members, this is in the early 20th century, especially the white members high in the organization were skeptical of connecting to African liberation movements and skeptical of having too close ties to socialism. So the organizational goals came to heads with the organizational structure. For me, once again, it speaks to the need to situate the meso level, the organizational level, in the context of the macro structure. It would be interesting, or at least I think it would be interesting for the authors to say a bit more about this issue and the extent to which organization structures can act as barriers to actually attaining meaningful social change. Thanks so much for listening to my 2 cents. I'm looking forward to hearing what everyone else says.
Thanks, Sally. Perfect timing. We lost you a little bit. Can I just check that Silke and Claire caught all the questions? Okay, that's great. Thank you. Bandana, the floor is yours.
Okay. I'm just going to use the slide to keep myself in check that I don't run over time. So, you know, as I expected, as the speaker to go after the first speaker, Ali, there is a lot that Ali spoke about that I wish to say, yes, second that, second that, second that. And that leaves me free to talk about a few of the issues that I have been thinking about because I read your book. And I want to begin by saying that my own social location is I do read the social movement literature, but I don't describe myself as a social movement researcher. And there is a difference there. But I do have worked in the area of human rights, which very centrally threads the literature on social movements, activism, protests, questions of rights, citizenship, and all of these other issues together. And of course, the other part that informs what I'm going to say is an abiding interest in knowledge hierarchies, like what gets highlighted, what doesn't get highlighted, and what are the longer term implications of what we say. So that's where I'm coming from. The things I loved about your book, it's the number of sub-disciplines, entire streams of conversation that you've been able to bring together. So very recently, Silke and I, along with another colleague in Sweden, were able to work on a book on humanitarianism and inequality, where we were looking at not so much the social movements, but all of these other organizations at various levels that were trying to create positive change. And it was wonderful to see you writing about social change organizations. Obviously, your writing predated or putting that book together, where you're looking at this continuum between the social movement organizations and all of these other entities, whether they're described as NGOs or not described as NGOs, whether they have a longer abiding presence or they're more ephemeral in the face of crises. But this incredible richness of movements, practices, along with more secure or ephemeral organizations, all working towards a certain change. And as you rightly say, it's not as if all of these go in the same direction. There's coalescence, there's contradictions, there's conflict, and out of those, depending on the relative power of each of these groups that are engaged in on some issue, an issue about which they care a lot for various reasons, we get some outcome from that. So again, I personally haven't seen too many other things. In fact, I have not seen anybody bringing all of these together. And I was incredibly grateful that you have. So thank you for that. Along with that, thank you for making it so clear right at the beginning, in terms of we are focusing on these places that we know very well. Because anytime people are talking about theories, there's a tendency to kind of leave it open as though it just goes and applies to the rest of the world. And you made it clear that no, it's based on these cases, these areas we know. And actually, that declaration is incredibly important in terms of how we do our research and how we expect to move forward. So I do want to mark that. I also want to mark that in a small book, you have an incredible richness of case studies. I mean, you're not presenting it as simple case studies, but, like the feminist movements from all aspects. I could read across the chapters and I felt so fulfilled. Great thing. I really like that. I liked your historical grounding where you made these, three pathways, the colonialism to BLM, socialism to neoliberalism, and fascism to right-wing organizing. Now, understandably, and I do understand it, but the colonialism to BLM, if it was a longer book and if that was a chapter, there was a lot more to write on that. So, just reading it in the way and I know you had to do it that way, I just felt that I know you're trying to establish, or coming at it from an anti-racist perspective, but colonialism and around the world, all its manifestations, and BLM as it happens, there's just so much more to write. Again, it wouldn't fit into this book, but if you're talking about, these themes further, I felt that requires more attention and maybe a little more. My suggestion would be work that section out a bit more so you can provide more of the details, which I'm sure you have. I like the idea of your reminding us that fascism existed and continues to manifest itself in all kinds of forms, whether we call it right-wing organizing, authoritarianism, and the ways in which, through the control of contemporary social media, it just takes on a different shape, form, cadence, actually, and begins to permeate our lives, whether we wish for it or not. That was a very important point. Your other point about the social change makers, very important. I know you further developed the idea of passionate professionals, which was wonderful, because that idea, you have passionate people, but passion itself does not lead to an aim. That was wonderful. And of course, they act as conduits of change. You mentioned funding, and I like that. However, just as thinking of the conversation further, one of the things that you might consider, again, as you think of it further or give other book talks, that because you're focusing on the particular areas that you're focusing on, funding takes on a different meaning than if you were thinking of similar change-making organizations in other parts of the world. For example, my friend and colleague Munir Saidani in Tunisia has been talking about how funding coming from the global north and pushing the funding towards particular themes within Tunisia, then both shape academia, what people are able to do and write, and ultimately some of those same people are involved in policy. So this, again, it of course, vestiges of those processes are, all around us. But, perhaps thinking further, that's an issue that you might want to talk about a bit more, because you have all the seeds and all the, initial parts of it. The part that I'm looking at the time, I'm going to share this really quickly because I kind of feel like maybe you hadn't considered this part as much, is you don't have to look at the whole diagram. It is complex. It's taken from something Vrushali Patel and I have done. But the idea is that all of these organizations, whether they're social movement organizations, a variety of NGOs and so on, particularly located in the global north, whatever they're producing, they're also producing a series of ways in which people are forced to understand the world. And why I'm saying force is because some of this talk is picked up by other institutions, other organizations, the media in the North, and so on and so forth. And they persist through historical time and get into other recesses, so that the change is not simply about, is it a policy change? Did something on the ground change? Did, how we understand the world change? All of those, yes. But it is also, and Silke, you have written about this, because of the dominance of English and so on and so forth, it goes and begins to fundamentally change how people in other parts of the world are kind of allowed to think about and define certain problems. So I just wanted to leave that with you. So those are my main points. At the end of the day, again, as you're thinking of the coalescence and the disjunctures, if you will, if you can also begin to imagine not what's happening in the areas that you defined, but does it have, ramifications? Perhaps, because the traces of what's happening now will linger, or the ramifications of how does this then get projected through the funding cycles, through the discourse, through the very ways in which we define what can be changed, what are the procedures, and that step back and that larger global view, which I know you can talk about. By the way, I know that personally because of the other work you have done, but I wanted to just raise that. So that's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Bandana. Perfect timing as well. Thank you. Margaret, you're next.
Hi, everyone. I'm Margaret Perez Brower. And my first comment is just to say that I really wish this was published sooner, because I published a book this year and I would have loved to have cited and engaged this work. So in lieu of that opportunity, today, a lot of my comments are going to be about putting this work in conversation with my research. Because I am a social movement scholar, I do study organizations, and I think in putting it in conversation with some of my work, I think for the purpose of this panel, I can really underscore the contribution of your work and how it illuminates these nuances among social change organizations in current time and in other research, and also reveal some opportunities maybe for further growth and development of the concepts and tools that you all give us to make sense of these complex organizations. Before I engage in that, though, I want to just first highlight some big picture contributions that I think the work is making, and just things I really liked. The first is that I think you both provide such a rich ecosystem of advocacy and activism that encompasses social change groups. And I found that to be really refreshing, because within this ecosystem, you show that there really are connections and reactions between both social change organizations, but also like social movement groups and activists. And so this approach to understanding this ecosystem, in order to really understand it, you provide the historical variable context, which have already been discussed by the previous panelists. But I think that's really important, because when we're trying to understand such a vast and complex ecosystem, it allows us to see how there is an interconnectedness of a myriad of social, political, and cultural forces at play. And so I really appreciated that. I also like that you showed that social change organizations can have dual roles in both addressing and perpetuating inequities. For example, you showed there's some feminist groups that reinforce white supremacy hierarchies, where there are other groups. You give an example of middle-class white feminists that boycotted products of enslaved labor, right? This was pre-fair trade activism. And so that duality I really appreciated, because I felt like it was very real. Like I felt that this book does such a good job of showing the nuances of organizations in a way that really breaks with patterns of really trying to box these groups in, and not kind of show these complexities of how they engage with power in different ways based on these historical contexts. So I really appreciated that. And then throughout this, the global perspective and comparative case studies were just very impressive. And so I really enjoyed thinking about these organizations across states, regimes, and different types of structures. So that was all really wonderful, and I really appreciated that. The rest of my talk is just going to be about rooting your book and some of my research and experiences with social change organizations. Very briefly, I've been working directly with and studying social change orgs for over a decade, and most recently I focus on how intersectionality plays an important role in shaping the behaviors of advocacy groups. And I also think about how the absence of this commitment in practice has real harms and should be concerning if we want to live in an equitable and just democracy, wherever we may be. And so keeping that in mind, that is the work that I do, and now engaging with the work that Roth and Saunders gave us, you all talk about the important role that intersectionality can play in how organizations frame and pursue social change. For example, you talk about the Sister Song collaboration and how in collaborating with another group, reproductive rights, became reproductive justice. And so there's that synergy when we bring in an intersectionality framework and when groups are kind of rubbing off on each other. You also talk about different types of social change makers, which has been discussed previously, reformists versus radical groups, and how these roles can be connected to intersectional or mainstream outcomes. And one example is the Women's March in the US, and how they had competitive goals around what it meant to be, what it meant to do a Women's March, who it was meant to represent, what issues were on the table. And so I just want to emphasize this in my own work. I find the intersectionality commitments to, in its absence, really do shape overall outcomes of social change organizations and how they frame their initiatives, how they work with other groups, how they're perceived, how they work with the state. And it was really nice to see this thoughtfulness of your work in diving into intersectionality and showing how it's a force that contributes to these dynamics of social change organizations. And so I really appreciated that. You also talk about how social movement and social change organizations interact and influence one another. And I think that's a really important point that I like to underscore. In my own interviews and research, I've learned that some women of color organizations that I studied are leading gender-based violence movements. And talking to them, it was interesting because I learned that for many of these folks, they said that the Black Lives Matter movement did more to help them advance their goals and strategies than the Me Too movement or traditional gender-based violence movements. And so in that finding, I felt that it really aligned with the complexity you showed us about how these groups can change and move each other, even if they're addressing different issues, or at least what seems at the surface different issues. Another thing that you all do that I really appreciated was how you use the inside and outside activism and advocacy framework as concepts to showcase the interplay between groups and different orientations to the state and other structures. And in doing so, you can also show that groups can shift from insider to outsider and vice versa. And thinking about my own work in this and how you apply the insider-outsider activism, one thing that I thought that I'd like to hear a little bit more from you is thinking about how groups can actually occupy both statuses at the same time. In the book, you show that they can shift from one to the other, but not necessarily occupy inside and outsider status at the same time. But in some of my work, I have found, for example, there's an organization that has grassroots listening circles, and they're building local leader coalitions and change, which are very much outside activism, but simultaneously have a lobbying advocacy arm where they're working on inside activism. And one role is because it started as a grassroots shelter and it kind of grew into these functions. But one thing I would have loved to see too is not only thinking about how you shift from insider to outsider, but how you can occupy these roles at the same time. Another thing you offer us is thinking about resources. And so you discuss the competition of resources and how large organizations can sometimes take away some of these resources due to broader networks or stable funding sources. And I think a lot about that in my own work. And in my own work, I find that and when it comes to funding and thinking about bigger and smaller organizations, I find that funding also varies by whether or not you're serving intersectionally marginalized populations or more vulnerable populations. And so while in your book, you just discussed the disparity of resources among these types of organizations, where one place that could go further is thinking about how this distribution of resources affects social change itself. You give examples of how some groups like the Greenpeace, again, impacted by what funding's available and what support is there. But I also think we should pay attention to how resources to certain groups also means taking away resources from often more marginalized and grassroots organizations. And so I would have loved to have seen some more engagement there. One other key thing I wanted to highlight is I really like the attention to social change makers as a whole, and you give us some really great examples and frameworks for thinking about professionalization versus unpaid and paid internships, and how they come in and out as boundary crossers, right, in these organizations. One thing I would love to hear more from you, though, is a little bit more on leadership, change makers who occupy leader positions, because I do think that leadership feeds into these different characteristics of both the meta, the social change organizations, and the change makers who are drawn to the organizations. And in my own work, I find that leadership and the types of leadership structures, such as mid-tier leadership or more hierarchical leadership structure or horizontal, do end up profoundly changing the types of initiatives, groups, and change makers that occupy social change organizations. And so I would love to hear more from you about how you think about leaders within this, the broader ecosystem of groups and within your broader concepts of change makers. And finally, this is my last comment. I'm going to end my comments with a ironic contradiction asked to all of you, which is, in many ways, you take a book and you show us how we cannot tightly put these orgs into boxes, and that there's so much more broad and nuances to how they behave and engage. And yet I still want a typology after I leave the book. And so one thing I'm hoping you can talk, even a very loose typology, but one thing I'd like to leave with in my comments is that I would love, especially for students or social change organizations themselves, if you were to give us a loose typology, what would it look like? How would certain characteristics such as reformist map onto resources and tactics? And how would reformists differ based on whether or not they're engaging in inside versus outside activism? The book tells such a great nuanced story about these organizations and why we can't box them up neatly, but that made me wanting them to be boxed back up, but maybe in a more fluid way that matches the spirit of the book. That's it.
Thanks, Margaret. And finally, John.
Yeah, thanks very much. I really enjoyed the conversation so far. I hope I can live up to it. I'm conscious as well that everyone comes from a sociology or social movement background, and my day job really is in public policy. It's studying public policy. So I feel like I'm a bit like the accountant at the dinner party. You don't want to be held up in the corner with. But I'll try and keep it exciting. So first thing I want to say is, just really thanks so much for the opportunity. So for me, Clare and Silke occupy there's such a fond part of my academic journey in different ways. So Silke is I'm a colleague of mine at Southampton and has been for years, a fantastic colleague, a really great sounding board, a really great person to get advice off and read each other's work and spark up ideas of each other. And as always, to me, is a bit of a model actually for how to keep the old-fashioned ethos alive in the neoliberal university. And Clare, I don't know, but Clare precedes me within my department. So I think you left, Clare, maybe only a year before I arrived, and is thought of very, very fondly still in the corridors of the Murray building. And I know I can see a lot of the people here are former colleagues as well. And obviously your reputation precedes you in that way. And I think what you share is this really, strong ethos to the way you go about your work. And this comes through really, really strongly in the book, which I really, really enjoyed reading. And like everyone else, I'm going to use the idea of the critic quite loosely because I'm very, very enthusiastic about the book. Instead, what I'm going to do is focus on what I see as its biggest strengths, which really reinforces a lot of what's come already. And then I have a sort of a very gentle provocation or something, I'm interested on how you might reflect at the end. So the key thing, I mean, I've called them magic tricks. There's a couple of magic tricks that you do in the book that I find very impressive. And the main one for me is about the scale and the scope. So as I say, I'm not a sociologist or social movement scholar, so I'm not used to books that are going to tell me about all time and place, right? I'm used to much more, biting off much smaller slices. And I was, the thing you're able to do here is, on the one hand, it's this sort of magisterial argument, but on the other, one that gives us quite a kind of intimate sense of the world of the individuals within these social change organizations and the social change makers. So, I mean, it speaks to when I must have bumped into you, Silke, in the corridor somewhere, or maybe it was on a Zoom call at some point or something, and you said you were writing a book with Clare. And I thought to myself, oh, a whole book, right? I wonder, I could see you, writing an article with someone who does something quite different to you is, happens all the time, but a whole book is a big undertaking, because in my kind of the way I boxed you both up was, Clare, I knew from her work in environmental politics and the environmental movement and protest politics. And Silke, your work is, again, I'm aware that the work I'm most aware of is around aid and aid land and aid workers. And I thought, although that would be really interesting to look across, but it would be really difficult to do because they're really different forms of what you end up calling social change organizations, right? One is largely around service delivery in a very different sort of context. The other one is largely around contestatory politics, and particularly Clare's work, a lot of it's been in the UK, right? So the scale here, I thought, oh, that's interesting. I wonder how they're going to manage it. And yeah, it's this broad kind of magisterial sweep, but one that also, because it's based on really, really detailed, grounded research, one of the most impressive parts of the book, to be honest, is when you turn to the appendix and you see it's essentially, 20 years worth of career for two of you, however many projects, I think it's 10 projects at least over the course of that period that you're drawing on for this research. And what that gives it is this sense of really knowing this world. So you really, really know, and we really get a sense of what these people working in these, particularly the social change makers, as you call them, what their world's like, what their blind spots and their challenges and what their dilemmas and what their frustrations are. And so being able to kind of see both ends in that way, I think is it's a really rare thing, I think, in a book, being able to do that. The other magic trick is this one's less of a magic trick and I think more just sensible, nuanced social science. But it's around the tone of criticality. So a lot of manuscripts of this sort tend to go one of two ways. They're either kind of quite breathless defenses of the brave and tireless work of activists and people working in aid organizations and so on, who make social movements and civil society organizations and development organizations work, or they are kind of hypercritical accounts of the gendered and racialized practices and prejudices that manifest, and probably more so of the kind of dirty hands issue. So that activists trade their ethical or ideological purity for power, for proximity to power, for influence. And what's really, really nice, this book is definitely not falling into either essentialist trap, right? So you're very, very, very careful to see all sides of this and to bring in that variety. And I'm not going to talk, the other kind of magic trick I was going to talk about, but I think everyone else has covered it in great detail already, is what I would call the bricolage. You brought in so many different ideas and thoughts, and the range of examples and so on is just quite magnificent, really. So all these things make it just a grounded, nuanced, really convincing set of arguments. but I'm going to end with a wee provocation. Okay, so I noticed when I was delivered the book, which now it doesn't show properly on Zoom, does it? Because it mirrors. But anyway, very lovely to have the book in the hand. And I had a look at the back, and someone talked about a hopeful. So John Dean has written about a hopeful examination. And I've been reading quite a bit of work sort of adjacent to this lately. And I would not describe yours as a deeply hopeful take. Right? I think it is, I think the word Ali used before was about a kind of pragmatic or, concerned about the incremental. And that I have a lot of sympathy for the tone that you take, which is this sort of quiet appreciation for the stoicism of people, but also with a hint of criticality about whether what they're doing is really in aid of the supposed aims. But in the sphere of things I'm reading elsewhere here, I detect a lot more hope and optimism in at least some of what I'm reading. So I've been reading lately about, particularly around social movements, people who talk about the emotion work that happens in social movements and the ethics of care, in particular around a kind of idea around the politics of hospitality and community. And that this is kind of growing or becoming stronger, and it's seen as an opposition to the growing retrenchment of social security and austerity and all the conditionality and all the terrible things we see across the world. The accelerating, capital sort of monster, the greed and waste of global corporations, and the aggressive and intrusive surveillance of the state into people's lives, and that this is a sort of hopeful reservoir against that. So I have in mind here in particular people like David Woodley's work on Black Lives Matter, or Sarah Marie Hall, closer to home, about feminist geographies of austerity, or my longtime collaborator Selena Khan writing about knitting nanas protesting against coal seam gas extraction. In Australia, and I was just thinking, yesterday, with Rishi Sunak making the announcement, and in the background we have things can only get better. I imagine that might be a theme that returns, a theme song that returns in the next few weeks. And this sort of vibe, right? That things are, we're at a historical point where things may be getting better. And I know that's not really the purpose of your book, but I'm interested, right? Do you have this sense of hope that I'm detecting in a lot of other work that is at least adjacent to what you're writing about? Or are you going to keep things on the level, keep a more measured approach? So I'll leave you to mull over that, as well as all the other provocations that you've got from everybody else. But I lastly just want to reiterate that I think this is a really fabulous book. It's ambitious, it's nuanced, it's really cogent, and it further cements the utmost respect I have for you both as academics that I think fondly of in my academic journey.
Thanks, John, and thanks to all the so-called critics, even though they've all rejected the label. It's now time for Clare and Silke to respond.
Okay.
You got about 10 minutes. I think Silke is going first. Is that correct?
Yes, briefly. So
Speak up, please.
thank you so very, very much for all the kind words. It's humbling. And I must say, after we submitted the book, I wanted to rewrite it because I thought there's so much more to say, and I'm currently using it in the classroom. And when I read it, I think, oh, there's so much more to say. This is too superficial. So hearing you is incredibly assuring, but I'm also very, very grateful for all the provocations. And I want to start with Ali's points, which links to just what John said about hope. The question, to what extent is it lasting? I think that is such an important question. And I think the way how we approached it in the book, or the way how I see it, and I think we see it similar, is that there is never a win. There is everything that is gained needs to be defended. So there are ongoing, whenever a group makes advantages, yeah, whether that is with respect to civil rights, whether it's with respect to gender rights, disability rights, whatever, there are people who feel that their privileges are attacked and they are trying to defend it. So it is a constant back and forth, and so I'm not sure whether we will ever be at a point where there will be a permanent gain. People who are privileged, who are in power, will try to hold on to that, and one has to push against it. So I think that we simply have to continue examine when these fights for social justice are successful, and I always believe it requires broad coalitions in order to make progress and to keep progress. And I'm incredibly afraid about the current situation where with elections in the United States and elsewhere, we might just face very, very difficult situations across the world. So I'm actually not so hopeful. I think what needs to happen is constant pushing against, constant mobilizing in a variety of forms. And I really appreciate how you all addressed that Claire and I try to emphasize the multiple tactics that are supplementing each one another. So it's not just one right way of going about things. It is always this combination of advocacy and protest, and it might be mutual aid which supports communities. So that would be my first answer, and I hand over to Claire. Perhaps we can go back and forth, or we open it up. Do you want to come in?
Yeah, can you hear me okay? So I just want to thank you all very much as well for your comments. It's really nice to hear that you think we've done some really good work here. And I really like the way John phrased it, that we've kind of positioned ourselves in between being apologists for social change organisations or really harsh critics, and we don't want to do either, which I think relates to something that Bandana was also saying around how we have to take our own roles really responsibly, and how we have to make sure we're not perpetuating dangerous stories that will live on, which means that we have to see ourselves as social change makers, and we also have to learn from some of the lessons in our book, because of course Bandana's right, everything that we have written has a legacy and will live on and will have its own sets of reactions and interactions among the people who read the book. So yeah, we have tried to take that really seriously, and that's part of the reasoning why we've pitched it in the way that we have. So I just wanted to say something about that first. I think it's really so important that we consider the decolonization agenda, and of course very difficult to do that in one short strand. Thank you for your understanding, Bandana, of why we did it the way we did. But I think Silke and I both think that there are more books here that could come out of this this groundwork that we've started. Shall I carry on?
Yeah, I just, perhaps about, so one thing that we said that we were thinking about a book which brings together both the environmental movements and the humanitarian discourse on humanitarianism, and ground that in colonial and post-colonial developments, and that would allow us to go more in depth. So that is one future book. So you go on.
Thanks. So if I could say something about, one of you asked a question about how we get durable and effective change. That was Ali. The answer is, I think Silke's already tried to answer it. We don't really know exactly what the conditions are, because every moment is completely different in its context with sets of different actors. So it's really difficult to do anything that can isolate the factors that have made success at one particular point in time. But I think our chapter on outcomes tries to tackle this. And one of the things, Ali, you were suggesting was that you can get policy change, legislative change, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the way people think about things and the way people act is going to change. So what we tried to do in our chapter on outcomes was to write about policy changes, but also write about the limits of policy changes, and how also you need to change people's hearts and minds and have cultural change as well as the biographical changes, and how all of those interact with one another. So again, I think it just comes back to our simple answer is through sets of actions, interactions and reactions that are highly contextually and contingently specific. And then just to come back to Margaret's point about how do you be an organisation that works on both the inside and the outside at the same time. Thinking specifically about environmental organisations, my short answer to that for now would be that it's very difficult to be completely inside or completely outside. So if you think of an organisation like Friends of the Earth, it's able to sit on government roundtables about sustainability. It's able to engage local communities in lobbying their MPs really hard, and it's also able to engage in actions supporting people to protest. But the fact that it does all three at once means that it's not fully doing one. So if it was completely inside all the time, it would then find it really difficult to compromise its stance and do the other things as well. And then just to come back to John's point about hope, am I hopeful? I think probably 25 years ago when I was first in academia, I was very hopeful. One of the really difficult things about writing about social movements is that the environmental movement, for example, hasn't changed an awful lot, but it's been lobbying really hard, protesting really hard, and still not a lot's happened. I think that maybe many of the hopeful scholars are people who are a bit younger, and there is a lot of terrible stuff going on in the world that, you know, we could all have a big collective cry about, which I think is why the stuff on emotions and dealing with grief is powerful and important, and the community building work has become really important as well. That's my quick answer to the main provocations. I hope that was okay.
Very, very good. So should we go and to the questions in the Q&A and the hand that is raised?
Yeah, can I just say before we open up to questions, you're very welcome to either talk or put it on the chat. I'm very happy to read out if you don't want to speak out. But the first question is from Nadira. Nadira, apologies, I don't know how to pronounce your name. Maybe I've butchered your name so much that you don't know. There's somebody with the hand raised. Would you like to ask a question?
There's also a question from David in the Q&A. So we could also answer that while we are waiting for the other person.
I can't see the question, so go ahead.
Okay, David has Owen asked, consider change that is in some relevant sense progressive compared to the status quo and is durable, but where that durability can itself be a problem insofar as it becomes an obstacle for further positive change. How do you situate this kind of case in your conceptual framework? And the question would be that what we are looking at social change organizations as both bringing about and trying to prevent social change. So we are not only talking about progressive organizations, or we also look at conservative or organizations and look at them as countering one another, as I just tried to explain before, that if there are gains made by social justice and progressive organizations, there are probably some that are trying to defend their privilege and the status quo. So preventing social change is also part of our overall model. So I hope that answers the question, but happy to explain further. Margaret also had a desire for typology, and we wanted to say that on page 34 we do deliver a kind of typology, a loose typology, where we discuss that organizations might engage in just one tactic, only advocacy or only service provision or only protest, but many do multiple things. And so based on what the organizations do, on what kind of resources they need, we develop this this outline instead of a strict typology. So.
We did struggle with the typology. didn't
Yeah.
we? We tried putting things in boxes, and then we thought, no, organizations don't work in boxes like that.
So, and I mean, while we are waiting for more comments or questions, I also wanted to pick up what Bandana said about the knowledge production. I think that is also such an important point, both in terms of hierarchies, but also in the form that that social change organizations are learning organizations. It's if one deals with social change, it's always about figuring something out. And so what is the problem, what to do about the problem, how to convince other people to do it, and so on. So so I think that learning is just so central whenever we are looking at social change, because these are learning processes and ways of how we think about things. So, Harry, I think if you wanted to, you could probably also unmute, and
I think we have to click answer. Right, that's David's.
David has his hand up.
okay. Yeah, okay. So can you unmute? Is it possible?
Right. Yeah, no, I've been given permission to unmute.
So apologies to the, sorry, David, apologies to the earlier person then, as I understand it, I should have given them the right to speak. So if you want to speak again, I'll do that. I do apologize. Sorry, David, carry on.
So I was just very interested in what Silke was just saying about the politics of knowledge and social change organizations as kind of learning organizations. Because Claire mentioned earlier that, you know, in a sense, they are social change in this book. They're basically acting as social change agents. So that kind of raises the question about how they see the book in relation to social change organizations. So do they see the book as playing a role in informing the work of social change organizations? Is it in that sense meant to have a kind of play a learning role to help those organizations? Or what's the relationship between the book, as it were, and the sort of subject of the book?
Okay, so we have multiple audiences in mind. So on the one hand, we have people in mind who are analyzing social change broadly, who are analyzing advocacy groups or social movements organizations, what we find frustrating because it's very siloed. There is no dialogue. We are trying to bring these different groups of scholars together and see things differently. But we also want to make this book to be useful for activists and people engaged, social change makers engaged in these organizations. And so far we have had some very nice feedback that people said, yes, what we are describing really resonates with what they are doing. So, so in a way, the book is addressing people who are making change, as well as the people who are analyzing people and organizations making change. And
yeah, I would totally agree with that, and that was why in writing the book, we were just really careful to make sure that we were being fair to all of the brilliant people out there who do so much hard work to try to make social change happen, or to prevent nasty social changes from happening. I've been a little bit of an activist myself at times, and I've read some really damning critiques of some of the stuff I've done, and it's so painful to read that. So I really did want to write something that would be useful for the social change makers and social change organisations themselves. We've been invited to give a talk at the Voluntary Studies Network, and we've had, what's the organisation that's interested in working with us? Sue Tibbles.
Yeah, but also Trussell Trust has also invited us to contribute to their strategy meeting. So there are organizations who think what we are doing is useful, hopefully.
And I think that's book Silke and Clare book number 3 is a really useful guide on social change making that we've written in collaboration with lots of other social change makers.
Jonathan.
Yeah, and there's also Harry. We shouldn't, but Jonathan first, and then perhaps Harry.
Hi. No, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. No, this is fantastic. This is more prompted by my reflecting on what's going on and just observing lots of young people setting up camps right now and protesting Gaza, and then thinking back to my own, well, I guess it was graduate school days, but the early 2000s with protests against the war in Iraq and the war on terror in the US. And this is less about like how the change happens with organizations, but since one of the things you're looking at is social change makers, I'm struck by how a lot of my friends who are involved in those movements then transitioned from just being activists to perhaps going to NGOs, and now actually a lot in my generation and cohort are kind of involved in just institutional party politics, right? And I'm wondering if you noticed almost like and I've just been reflecting a lot on like lifestyle, life stage or life cycle kind of dynamics that go on with respect to change makers. So I'm wondering if you had like any thoughts about that in through your research.
Perhaps I should answer that, because a lot of the research that I have done in various contexts has employed biographical methods. And so we then see how activists move from different types of organizing for change or change making in a variety of contexts. And I mean that people might then take on jobs that allow them to pursue their ideals, or they have jobs that have nothing to do with their political convictions, but then are active as volunteers. So I think it is always important to understand activism or social change making in the life course and how it changes over time. And I remember that a couple of years ago, I met with a former undergraduate student who had taken an earlier version of the course, so Collective Action and Social Change, which in some ways is the basis of this book. And she told me that after graduating, she had first worked for an NGO, and then she had stood for politics as a local politician, and now she was working for a corporation in corporate social responsibility. And for her, it was so important that the protest groups existed to put pressure on the company she was working for. So she was really aware of what can be done in different sectors: public sector, private sector, third sector. And I think that is, some people stick with one particular cause or particular form of activism all their lives, and others are moving between different causes. And throughout the book, we have tried to illustrate that with various vignettes that drew on Claire's projects or on my projects, to illustrate how yeah, activism changes over the life course. And of course, I mean, what you just, and I mean, one thing that we worked on together 10 years ago or so was Occupy, and these interviews with people who participated in Occupy, they had been in climate camps, or they had been at Green and Common, or they had never been active before. And it would be really, really interesting now to talk to people who are participating in the Gaza camps, the older ones, yeah, to what extent they might have been involved with Occupy or other protest events.
Yeah, I just will agree with everything that Silke said there. It really is important to talk to people involved in activism. I've just been writing up some work I did. We did about 60 short qualitative interviews with people who participated in the G7 environmental protests in Cornwall. And there are some people still going to protests who've been going to loads and loads and loads of protests over the last 25 to 30 years, which is incredible. And although sometimes we do see people kind of become increasingly institutionalized, maybe starting off in radical activism, then moving to NGOs, and then moving to more institutional forms of political participation, you quite often see the reverse as well, where people have been involved in NGOs and they get disillusioned and think it isn't working, and then turn to direct action. So yeah, I think it just depends on people's experiences and how frustrated they get. And of course, there are also the people we've not talked about yet, are the people who get burned out and get fed up and leave activism. There are a significant bunch of people as well. The stalwarts, I think, that, you know, the people that keep protesting and keep participating in something for a long, long time, they're the special people, but they are a minority. Thank you. That was a nice question. I like that one.
So Harry, do you want to speak rather than, or should we read out your?
Hiya, Silke. Yeah, why don't I speak? Yeah, it's really interesting to hear this. I sort of wish I'd nipped over, or I may not have been welcome. I sort of wish I'd nipped over campus. I could have just sat and listened to you in person. Would be even more interesting. But yeah, it's really interesting to hear all these different views. So, I mean, I suppose my question is in danger of being one of those, I'm interested in a certain area. Can you talk about that for a minute? But you know, to the extent it might be useful. So I suppose it's just a couple of thoughts that I had, or reactions from my specific perspective as someone thinking about criminal justice, and you know, as you know, more recently thinking especially about well, what in a way could call social change makers in my area. So I suppose one thought is, if I think about my own work, my own experiences, is that one thing I've noticed, and I suppose I'm just wondering any insights you have, because it might be you'll sort of provide me with a set of concepts to think about it, or terminology, because a lot of my work has been about indeterminate sentencing, which I won't give you a whole lecture on, but basically you have very discredited indeterminate sentences in England, where someone gets put into prison and they might die in prison unless they prove they're safe, which is tricky in prisons, funnily enough. And a whole range of a sort of broad coalition hates them. And you have the sort of usual suspects who would fall very much into, I think, your categories of social change makers and sort of progressives, and they see themselves in that way, and you know, broadly sort of social democratic, I suppose, and so on, and the usual organizations. But then you do have a much wider coalition, which includes, you know, really strong sort of libertarians. And so I suppose what strikes me interesting about that case, and I wonder whether you see it play out more broadly, or whether it struck you in other areas, is so on this specific policy issue, they agree that this sentence is wrong, it should be got rid of. But if you ask them to develop broader policy arguments in relation to prisons or in relation to criminal justice, that would all break down incredibly quickly. They'd all disagree with each other, and you wouldn't get anywhere, or their ideas of what social change should look like in that sense would be radically different. So I think it just strikes me as interesting specifically, but you know, I know that's not a unique dynamic to what I'm looking at. So I just wondered if you had further thoughts in that. And then you know, maybe I'll leave it there, and in the Q&A you'll have seen I put a second question just about maybe more prosaic changes that might be happening, but it may just be very anecdotal dynamics that I'm seeing based on a very, you know, small number of people I'm aware of. So you might have thoughts about more prosaic changes, possibly in terms of what people involved in social change making are doing prosaically.
I could just say a couple of things about. Can you hear me okay? Sorry, a couple of things about coalitions among social change organisations. I think you've identified a sort of general pattern really, Harry. So, you know, you could just think of something as simple as stop climate chaos or make poverty history. Both really important things. Both have had significant coalitions of hundreds of organisations signing up to them. But then when it comes down to the question of, well, how do you stop climate chaos? Or how do you make poverty history? Or what strategies or tactics should we use in order to make poverty history or stop climate chaos? Then things start falling apart at the seams quite often with coalitions. So yeah, I think you have identified a kind of a general problem that people can ascribe to progressive ideas, but not necessarily agree on how to get there, how to solve the problem, what the best solution would be, and what the tactics would be to get to the best solution.
Thank you, that's really helpful.
And I would like to follow up on that by trying to answer Matt's question. Matt wanted to have an elevator pitch or the book in a nutshell, and so my attempt to answer that is that, and that follows up on Claire's answer to Harry's question, is that as long as we talk about NGOs or advocacy groups or protest groups or third sector organizations as if they would be disconnected, we are missing the point that in reality, all these groups are in some form interacting, and that people are also moving in between these organizations. They might be part of two organizations at the same time, in one as staff member and the other one as volunteers. And so the reality is so much more messy and so much more interconnected than sociology or political science or public policy wants to have it, where there are these nice little separate disciplines. And what Claire and I have done is, because we both read a lot and very widely, is that we were just frustrated with all these silos, and we and it's perhaps a little bit arrogant or ambitious to throw this all together, but we just thought we go for it and try to show this big and nuanced picture, and so it's really lovely to hear that to some extent, based on the very friendly comments from our critics, we seem to have achieved that to some extent. And of course, I completely agree that we need to go deeper. Yeah, so there is it seems that we have just scratched the surface to bring it all together, and now there needs to be volume 2, 3, 4 to work through all it. Matt, is that okay? I have you can speak. I have
Yeah, that's great. No, it was really good. I mean, I think a quick follow-up would be just to say, you know, when you write a book, you really consolidate your ideas around things. And I was just wondering, in your journey, was there things that, when you were bringing all this literature together, was there also things that you kind of, you know, really learned and changed your mind about? I'd just be curious about that.
Well, it was more so that I mean, writing with Claire is just such a pleasure, because both of us want to get it right. And so when one of us felt that the sentence wasn't quite clear, or that it wasn't quite right, we just revised as long as we were both happy with it. And so so I think that both really being that writing is important to us and clarity is important to us, that just helped us to make the book readable. And and so I mean, some people think that if books are readable, they might not be as serious, but we put serious work into making it as clear as possible because we want it to be understood. And sometimes books are written or articles are written to keep people out. We want to do the opposite.
Yeah, and I just talk about a penny dropping moment that I had in the process of working with Silke on the book. It was one of the rare times while writing the book that we actually got together to meet. I went to Silke's house once, and we had a session at my parents' house as well because I live down in Cornwall. The rest of it we did in online meetings. But one of the penny dropping moments with me was when Silke put a book in front of me that was written by Van der Voort that's got stuff in it about subversive humanitarianism, which is basically the idea that providing services for people in need, by critics, it's seen as sticking plasters on wounds and not fixing the root causes of the problem, but actually the process of being on the front line and at a soup kitchen is a really transformative process for people that opens their eyes to the broader political issues and can then transfer those people to becoming more politically active. And my penny dropping moment when I thought, gosh, you could also think about that in terms of the environmental movement. And I think we do mention in the book subversive conservationism, because likewise, being out doing conservation projects and talking to other people about species decline or actually witnessing for yourself climate change in the context of other people doing conservation work, and also, you know, you're not just pruning brambles and making the situation better for birds and other species, you're also beginning to think about the root causes of all the environmental problems and becoming more political. So yeah, I just found that a really, really nice way of bringing together the literature on service provision and social movements in a way that I don't think anybody's really done before.
And perhaps one thing that I wanted to say, so it's so lovely to see Bandana here, and because while Claire and I were working on the Organizing for Change, Bandana and I, together with Tobias Denskos, were editing this volume on humanitarianism and inequality. And the literature on humanitarianism does not necessarily talk about social movements or, and as Claire just said, this subversive humanitarianism by Van der Voort, who has a chapter in our handbook, is very is very important because it reorients to think about humanitarianism. And if we bring that back to the current situation in Palestine, Gaza, it is, of course, we cannot talk about humanitarian intervention without political solutions, and the protests that are going on, they need to also be combined with humanitarian measures just to keep people alive. Yeah, so in that regard, it is really important to create a dialogue between these different debates, and also seeing that in a broader historical context, because obviously the situation in Gaza has started 100 years ago and not on the 7th of October. And so in that regard, I think our historical perspective, both at the social level or global level, at the organization level and the personal level, is really what drives our book. And it's so nice to now with Bandana, sitting between Bandana and Claire here on the screen is for me a highlight. So that's really wonderful. So I think we have a few more minutes. So if
Bandana's turned down.
Bandana says,
I just wanted to say hi to Claire, because as Silke mentioned, that all this, since the two books were proceeding kind of on parallel lines with synergies, it's a pleasure to finally meet Claire.
Same as that, Bandana. Lovely to meet you.
Yeah.
Lovely to have Silke as our broker.
Yes.
So we have a few more minutes. If somebody else wants to come in, also if John or Margaret want to come in again, that's also, or anybody from the audience, just say. speak up. Yeah, and Bindi has also raised her. Okay, John and then Bindi. You're mute now, John.
No, sorry, I didn't have a question. I just wanted to show I was still present. I had turned off my video so you could be the stars of the show. Let's hear from Bindi.
Okay.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. That's been fascinating conversations between all of you. So lovely afternoon away from dissertation marking. I just, in the last few minutes, I wondered if you both had thoughts on Ali Meghji's question about the need to differentiate between organizational messaging and organizational structures when thinking about the impact, or the positive impact of social change organizations. I just thought I'd bring you back to that question if you had any thoughts on that.
Okay, thank you. Yes. I didn't want to avoid that question. It's an incredible hard question. I think the way how we dealt with that in the book is the fact that on the one hand we are differentiating between different organizational structures which do to, and I mean I have done that also in earlier work, like 20 years ago, wrote about to what extent organizational structures do express the values of organizations and the people active in these organizations, and that then also does to some extent constrain what activities they can do, to what extent they are perceived as legitimate, what kind of organization coalitions they form, and so on. So I think I would answer the question very much. So it depends very much on what an organization wants to achieve in terms of what kind of organizational structure and tactics they are choosing, and there might be the emphasis to frame an issue and bring it on the agenda. In that regard, the signaling might be more important. Yeah, the short answer would be it depends. So, and
I'll just agree and say that I've noticed that some organisations might be quite radical in terms of the way they organise and the messages they put out, but still have quite moderate tactics. And Greenpeace is a really interesting example of an organisation that's got a bureaucratic structure, so you would expect it to be moderate, but it still breaks the law, even though it does it in quite carefully calculated ways. So yeah, it's a complex picture, and the organisations emerge to fill particular niches, I think, and have a sort of division of labour around the types of things that they do and don't do. And although values and messages and structures sometimes map, they don't always.
And perhaps we could also say what we also write about in the book a lot is the question of and I think that might be important to mention, not that the accusation of organizations being co-opted or prone or at risk of being co-optation if they become bureaucratized and professionalized. And yes, that is possible. Yeah, they might sell out, they might, but we make a case for compromise. And that is something Ali also backed up when he talked about the pragmatist angle of our work. Yeah, so there is always a very, very fine line to what extent a compromise can be productive because it moves things forward. And again, when I think about the discussion about Gaza at the moment, it's such a polarized debate, and the polarization makes it, and also the demands of people have to put out statements. Perhaps it is more useful if people are also doing something in the back, a little bit more silent, and build bridges. So I think there are, so on the one hand, so who benefits from statements? Yeah, so in some cases, statements are important. Yeah, in other cases, diplomacy is needed. There's always the risk that the compromise goes too far. And on the other hand, without a compromise, there might be no progress at all. And so I think that is there is always the question how much radicalism is necessary and how much compromise is necessary. And I don't think that there is a single answer for that. I think that is depend always on the situation. Yeah, and I mean that might sound like an easy way out, but I think it is actually very, very serious to engage with values in that way.
And perhaps that's an important point, Silke. And perhaps this whole issue around messaging is perhaps has been elevated because of digital media, or the tensions between messaging and organizational structures maybe is elevated because of digital media. So that's something to think about as well. But I appreciate your point about nuance, compromise, and pragmatism to move things forward rather than create a stalemate.
Thank you, Bendy. And you know what? Just what you're saying, to pick up what you're saying about social media. What I thought in the last days, I have to have another look at the book Effective Publics by Purkayastha, and to what extent public discourse really is more emotional on social media and what consequences that has. So since this is an event of the Center of Democratic Futures, this is also something we have to take forward. Bindi is one of the incoming co-directors, so it's also very nice that you are here.
Thank you. Nice to hear everyone.
Right, I think this would be a good time to wrap up. Apologies, I couldn't see the questions, and apologies, it took me a while to drive the speakers. So a big thank you to Silke and Clare, of course, and the fake critics, Ali, Bandana, Margaret, and John. And of course, not fake because they're fake, but because they've rejected the label. So I just want to make sure that they know that. Thank you also to everybody who's turned up today and asked questions and engaged with the event. And again, thank you to Arjun and Tracy for holding the fort. Thank you very much, everybody, and hopefully see you soon at the next event.
Thank you.
Thank
you
thank
for
you.
all your great comments.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much.
So let's see.
Arjun and Tracy are still there. Thank you, Arjun. Thank you, Tracy.
Yeah.
No worries. Yeah.
Bye.
So
Good. So you can have you stopped the recording?
To stop the recording, I have to end the meeting. So
okay.
let me see if I can actually stop recording.